The gates have fallen, the palace is burning, and as enemy soldiers pour through the smoke-filled corridors, the women of the royal household face a terror that ancient chronicles describe as worse than the sword itself. What awaited captured queens and princesses wasn't simply death. It was systematic erasure, public degradation, and a fate designed to destroy not just their bodies, but their very identity as symbols of power. In the ancient world, warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. Royal women occupied a unique position in the machinery of conquest. They were simultaneously human beings and living symbols of their civilization's power, legitimacy, and honor. To capture a queen, a princess, or the wives of a defeated king was to capture the soul of an entire people. Ancient military doctrine understood this principle with brutal clarity. These women represented dynastic continuity, diplomatic alliances, and the sacred authority of their bloodlines. Their subjugation served multiple strategic purposes. It shattered enemy morale, demonstrated the completeness of victory, and provided tangible proof that the old order had been irrevocably destroyed. The treatment of royal captives was never random or merely sadistic. It was calculated theatre, designed to communicate absolute domination to multiple audiences: the defeated population, the conqueror's own people, and neighbouring kingdoms watching to see the price of resistance. The Roman triumph represented the ancient world's most elaborate spectacle of humiliation. When Roman legions crushed foreign kingdoms, captured royalty became props in carefully choreographed displays that merged military victory with religious ritual and political propaganda. Consider the fate of Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony. After her parents' deaths and Egypt's annexation, she was paraded through Rome as a child, along with her twin brother, in Octavian's triumph of 29 BCE. The children walked in chains through streets packed with jeering crowds, past temples where their mother's image had been defaced, in a procession that lasted hours. They were dressed in the regalia of Egyptian royalty, not as honour but to emphasise what Rome had conquered. Vercingetorix's fate offers another perspective. While male, the treatment of the Gallic king's family illustrates Rome's methods. After his surrender, Vercingetorix spent 6 years in the Tullianum, Rome's underground dungeon, before being ritually strangled during Caesar's triumph. His wife and daughters disappeared from the historical record entirely, a silence that speaks volumes about their fate. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra experienced the full theatre of Roman captivity. After her rebellion was crushed in 272 CE, she was brought to Rome in golden chains, so heavy she required servants to carry them. Contemporary accounts describe her being paraded through the streets adorned in jewellery and precious stones, transformed into a living trophy. The Emperor Aurelian displayed her before enormous crowds, letting them see the once powerful warrior queen reduced to an ornament of Roman supremacy. The psychological dimension of Roman triumphs was carefully calculated. Captive royalty was forced to walk the entire route, often several miles, in full view of a hostile population. They witnessed their own treasures, looted from palaces and temples carried before them. They saw images of their cities burning, their armies being slaughtered, all while Roman citizens shouted insults and threw refuse. For noble captives who survived the triumph, what followed was often worse than the spectacle itself. Some were imprisoned for years in the Curia, a series of underground cells beneath the Roman Forum where darkness, disease and isolation eroded sanity. Others were placed in what Romans euphemistically called protective custody, comfortable confinement that nonetheless meant the complete erasure of their former identity. They lived, but as ghosts of royalty, their names remembered only as warnings. The Assyrian Empire perfected systematic cruelty as state policy. Their military inscriptions, carved in stone and preserved for millennia, describe the treatment of conquered peoples with unsettling pride. Royal women occupied a special place in this machinery of terror. The annals of Ashurbanipal record the conquest of Elam in explicit detail. After destroying the Elamite capital of Susa in 646 BCE, Assyrian forces captured the Elamite royal family. The inscriptions describe how the queens and princesses were taken to Nineveh, forced to march hundreds of miles through hostile territory, their royal garments stripped away and replaced with the clothing of servants. What made Assyrian captivity particularly devastating was its permanence. Unlike ransom systems in other cultures, Assyria rarely returned royal captives. These women were absorbed into the imperial household, their identities systematically dismantled. They were given Assyrian names, forbidden to speak their native languages, and deliberately separated from their children to prevent any continuation of royal lineages. The palace reliefs at Nineveh depict this process in stone. One famous panel shows foreign queens and noblewomen in positions of servitude, engaged in menial labour within the Assyrian court. These weren't merely servants, they were specifically identified as royalty, their degradation an essential part of the message. Every visiting diplomat, every conquered king considering rebellion saw these images and understood the price of defiance. Assyrian records describe the psychological techniques employed. Royal captives were forced to witness the execution of male relatives, the destruction of their city's patron deities, and the systematic erasure of their civilization's cultural heritage. They were made to participate in Assyrian religious ceremonies, publicly acknowledging the supremacy of Assyrian gods over their own. The fate of the daughters of Arabian queens provides specific examples. Multiple Assyrian inscriptions mention capturing Arabian queens and their daughters during campaigns in the Syrian desert. These women, rulers of nomadic confederations, were transported to Assyria, where they served as living proof of Assyrian power, extending even into the unconquerable desert. The Persian Empire approached royal captives with more nuance than Assyria or Rome, but the underlying principles remained brutal. Persian kings understood that captured royalty could serve as diplomatic leverage, hostages guaranteeing good behaviour, or symbols of imperial authority. When Darius III fled Alexander the Great at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, he left behind his entire household, his mother, wife, and daughters. Alexander's treatment of these women reveals much about how royal captives could be used. He kept them in honourable confinement, ensuring their comfort and safety, but also ensuring they remained highly visible symbols of Persian defeat. Statera, Darius's wife, died in captivity while still relatively young. While ancient sources claim Alexander honoured her with a royal funeral, she remained a prisoner until her death, separated from her husband and her role as queen. Her daughter, also named Statera, was eventually married to Alexander himself, a political arrangement that effectively erased her identity as a Persian princess and transformed her into a tool of Macedonian legitimacy. The Persian practice of taking royal hostages shaped international relations throughout the ancient Near East. When kingdoms submitted to Persian authority, they were required to send royal family members, often daughters or sisters, to the Persian court. These women lived in gilded cages, comfortable but utterly powerless, their presence ensuring their fathers and brothers didn't rebel. The harem system, while more complex than simple imprisonment, functioned as a form of perpetual captivity for conquered royalty. Women from defeated kingdoms were incorporated into the royal household, their status ambiguous. Neither slaves nor truly free, they bore children who might rise to prominence, but who also served as hostages, ensuring their maternal family's loyalty. Greek warfare showed comparable cruelty despite cultural pretensions to civilization. The fall of Troy, whether historical or mythical, established patterns that Greek armies followed for centuries. The fate of Trojan women, royal and common alike, became archetypes of wartime captivity. Euripides, the Trojan women, draws from actual Greek military practices. Queen Hecuba, once the most powerful woman in Troy, survives the city's fall only to see her daughters distributed as prizes to Greek commanders. Cassandra, a princess and priestess, is claimed by Agamemnon. Andromache, wife of the heroic Hector, becomes the property of Achilles' son. These weren't simply dramatic inventions, they reflected the standard treatment of captured nobility. The historical record confirms these practices. After Athens conquered the island of Melos in 416 BCE, punishing it for neutrality in the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians executed all adult males and enslaved all women and children. While not specifically royal, this demonstrates how supposedly civilized Greeks treated defeated populations. Thebes provides a more specific example. When Alexander the Great destroyed Thebes in 335 BCE, thousands were enslaved. The women of prominent Theban families, the closest thing to nobility in the city-state, were sold in slave markets throughout Greece. Their education, refinement, and aristocratic bearing made them valuable commodities, but also ensured they experienced their degradation more acutely than women born to servitude. Greek practices included a particularly cruel innovation: the distribution of noble captives as concubines to common soldiers. This wasn't simply about violence, it was about hierarchy inversion. Women who had commanded servants now served those of the lowest social rank. The psychological impact was calculated and devastating. The successor kingdoms that emerged after Alexander's death saw continuous warfare, and royal women became pawns in an endless chess game of dynastic struggle. The Ptolemaic, Seleucid, and other Hellenistic dynasties all practiced similar policies toward captured rivals. When Ptolemaic Egypt warred with the Seleucid Empire, captured royal women often faced forced marriages designed to legitimize the victor's claims. These weren't unions between equals. They were public demonstrations that one dynasty had absorbed another. The women involved lost their names, their children's legitimacy, and any shred of agency. The fate of Berenice II illustrates the precarity of royal status. Though not technically a captive, her marriage was arranged as part of peace negotiations following conflict between Egypt and Cyrene. She became Queen of Egypt, but only by surrendering her identity as Princess of Cyrene. Her subsequent murder by her own son reveals how royal women remained vulnerable even after achieving apparent safety. Multiple Seleucid princesses disappeared from historical records after their kingdoms fell to Roman expansion. The silence surrounding their fate suggests systematic policy. Captured royal women were either killed to prevent their descendants from claiming legitimacy, absorbed into obscurity through forced marriages, or exiled to remote corners of the empire where they could pose no threat. These practices weren't confined to Mediterranean civilizations. Ancient China saw comparable treatment of defeated royal households. When kingdoms fell during the Warring States period, the women of ruling families were incorporated into the victor's court, their children killed or castrated, their own identities systematically erased. The Qin conquest of the other six, warring states resulted in thousands of noble women being absorbed into the Qin imperial system. Historical records describe how these women, educated in the cultural traditions of their home states, were forced to adopt Qin customs and serve as living evidence of Qin supremacy. In ancient India, the Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft and military strategy, explicitly discusses the treatment of captured royal women. It recommends keeping them alive as hostages and status symbols, while ensuring they cannot produce legitimate heirs who might challenge the conqueror's authority. The text approaches this with cold pragmatism, treating these women as political resources to be managed like territory or treasure. Pre-Columbian civilizations in Mesoamerica followed similar patterns. When Aztec armies conquered rival city-states, the nobility of defeated peoples became captives with specific ritual functions. Women of ruling families were incorporated into religious ceremonies, their royal status repurposed to serve Aztec cosmology and political structure. Across civilizations, certain methods for destroying royal identity recur with disturbing consistency. Names were changed, not as simple renaming, but as assault on cultural identity. Royal captives were forced to abandon their birth names, which often carried religious or dynastic significance, and adopt names chosen by their captors. Language suppression served similar functions. Royal children born in captivity were forbidden to learn their ancestral languages. Within a generation, the linguistic connection to their heritage was severed, making it impossible for them to access their own culture's literature, religious texts, or diplomatic traditions. Forced religious conversion attacked spiritual identity. When Christian Byzantium captured pagan nobility, forced baptism wasn't simply about religion, it was about erasing the cultural and psychological foundations of the captive's worldview. Similarly, when Islamic empires captured Christian or Zoroastrian nobility, conversion served both religious and political purposes, permanently alienating converts from their communities of origin. The separation of mothers from children represented perhaps the cruelest mechanism. Royal women who might endure any personal suffering to preserve their dignity often broke under the systematic removal of their children. Sons were raised in enemy courts, trained to serve the very people who had destroyed their fathers. Daughters were married off to cement alliances, ensuring any grandchildren would belong to other dynasties. Physical marks of status were stripped away with calculated cruelty. Royal garments, jewellery and insignia weren't simply confiscated, They were publicly removed in ceremonies designed to emphasize the reversal of fortune. Some captives were forced to wear servants' clothing or, worse, garments identifying them specifically as conquered nobility, marking them for public humiliation. For royal women who survived initial capture, long-term imprisonment often followed. Unlike commoners, who might be ransomed, enslaved, or killed, royal captives occupied an ambiguous status that could extend for decades. Tower prisons held numerous royal women throughout ancient history. The Tower of London, while medieval, followed patterns established in ancient times. Royal captives required special facilities, both secure enough to prevent escape and comfortable enough to maintain their value as hostages or political symbols. Eastern harems functioned similarly. While Western imagination has romanticized these institutions, for conquered royal women they represented gilded cages. Strict protocols prevented communication with the outside world. Guards, often eunuchs, ensured no messages reached former allies. The women lived surrounded by luxury while experiencing complete powerlessness. Isolation destroyed minds more effectively than physical torture. Royal women, raised in positions of influence and surrounded by courts, suddenly found themselves cut off from all meaningful human contact. Guards weren't permitted to speak with them. Other captives came from rival kingdoms, making genuine friendship unlikely. Years could pass with nothing but hostile or indifferent faces. Ancient sources occasionally mention the mental deterioration of long-term royal captives. References to madness, melancholia, and despair appear in chronicles and inscriptions. Some captives stopped speaking entirely. Others developed elaborate delusions. Still others simply waited for death with a passivity that suggested complete psychological collapse. Perhaps no fate was crueler than bearing children in captivity. For conquered queens and princesses, pregnancy represented both continuation and destruction. Their children would live, but as monuments to their mother's defeat. These children occupied impossible positions. Sons born to royal captives might be raised as servants, soldiers, or hostages. They grew up knowing their mother's former status but experiencing only servitude. The psychological consequences can scarcely be imagined. To be told you are descended from kings while being treated as property. Daughters faced comparable contradictions. Some were raised in enemy courts and eventually married to establish political alliances, their mothers' suffering repurposed for diplomatic gain. Others simply disappeared into the anonymous ranks of palace servants, their royal blood meaning nothing. The most famous example remains the children of Cleopatra VII. Her daughter with Mark Antony, Cleopatra Selene, was raised in the household of Octavian's sister Octavia, the very woman Mark Antony had abandoned for Cleopatra. The symbolism was deliberate. The daughter of Rome's enemy, raised by a Roman matron, eventually married to an African client king. She became Queen of Mauritania, but only as Rome's creature, forever severed from her Egyptian heritage. Some ancient sources mention royal captives who refused to bear children, employing what methods they could to prevent pregnancy. These women understood that bringing children into captivity would only multiply the suffering. Their resistance took the only form available, the refusal to continue bloodlines that would be corrupted by conquest. Not all royal captives submitted passively. Ancient chronicles, written by victors, occasionally preserve hints of resistance, usually framed as stubbornness or madness, but revealing courage in impossible circumstances. Some chose suicide over captivity. When Athens captured the rebellious island of Lesbos, several women of prominent families killed themselves rather than face enslavement. Roman sources describe similar choices by Celtic noblewomen during the Gallic Wars. These weren't simply personal decisions, they were political acts, final assertions of autonomy. Others engaged in subtler forms of resistance. They maintained their languages in secret, teaching children ancestral tongues despite prohibitions. They preserved stories, genealogies, and cultural knowledge through oral tradition. They refused to adopt conquerors' religions despite pressure and punishment. A few attempted escape. Records mention unsuccessful flight attempts by royal captives, usually ending in recapture and harsher confinement. Success stories are rare in ancient sources, possibly because successful escapes meant the women returned to positions where they could shape their own narratives rather than appearing in their captors' chronicles. The most effective resistance was simply survival with dignity. To maintain identity, composure, and humanity while experiencing systematic degradation, required extraordinary strength. Ancient sources occasionally note this, usually with grudging respect. When Plutarch describes Zenobia's bearing during her captivity, his admiration is evident despite his Roman perspective. Behind the strategic calculations and political theatre stood individual human beings experiencing unimaginable trauma. These were women who had lived lives of education, influence, and comfort, suddenly thrust into conditions designed to break them psychologically. The cumulative effect of these practices extended beyond individual suffering. Entire generations grew up understanding that royal status provided no protection, that queens could become slaves, princesses could become servants, and the highest could fall to the lowest. This knowledge shaped ancient political culture, making diplomacy desperate and warfare apocalyptic. Modern archaeology and historical research continue revealing the scale of this suffering. Skeletal remains from ancient sites show evidence of malnutrition and disease among populations identified as enslaved nobility. Excavations of palace prisons reveal the cramped, dark conditions where royal captives spent years or decades. Contemporary ancient sources, when read, carefully reveal the psychological impact. Medical texts discuss treating melancholia in high-status captives. Legal documents mention disputes over ownership of royal prisoners. Marriage contracts specify the status of wives who were formerly enemy nobility. Each document represents individual tragedies hiding behind bureaucratic language. The treatment of captured royal women in ancient warfare reveals fundamental truths about how power operates through symbolism and performance. These women weren't simply casualties of conflict. They were deliberately weaponized, their suffering carefully calibrated to achieve specific political effects. What happened to them was indeed worse than death, as the opening promised. Death ends suffering. What ancient armies inflicted was perpetual, the destruction of identity, the erasure of meaning, the transformation of human beings into symbols of their civilization's defeat. They lived, but as warnings rather than people, monuments to power rather than individuals with agency and dignity. The historical record preserves their names, when it preserves them at all, primarily as footnotes to male rulers' stories. Cleopatra Selene, daughter of the famous queen, Statera, wife of Darius, Zenobia of Palmyra. Behind each name stands a complete human being whose experience of captivity we can barely imagine, despite ancient sources describing the mechanisms in detail. Ancient warfare's treatment of these women reflected broader truths about how civilizations understood power, legitimacy, and conquest. To destroy a kingdom completely, one had to destroy not just its armies and cities, but its symbols and bloodlines. Royal women embodied both, making their captivity essential to total victory. The cruelty wasn't incidental or merely sadistic. It was systematic, repeated across cultures and centuries because it achieved specific objectives. It terrorized enemies, demonstrated absolute victory, prevented legitimate rival claims, and provided tangible proof of conquest that could be displayed for generations. Understanding this history requires confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature and political power. The civilizations that practiced these methods weren't uniquely evil. They were employing the logic of their age with brutal consistency. The fact that such practices appeared independently across the ancient world suggests something disturbing about how power consolidates and demonstrates itself. The archaeological and historical evidence forces us to see ancient warfare not as distant abstraction, but as concrete human experience. Every triumph, every conquest, every empire came at a cost paid primarily by those least able to defend themselves. Royal status, which seemed to grant protection and privilege, became in defeat a source of additional suffering. Their stories, fragmentary and incomplete as they survive in ancient sources, testify to resilience amid horror. Some maintain dignity through decades of captivity. Some preserve their culture's memories for transmission to later generations. Some chose death over submission. Each response represented an individual human being asserting whatever agency remained amid overwhelming powerlessness. The historical record stands as witness to what they endured. From Assyrian palace inscriptions to Roman triumphal accounts, from Greek tragedies to Chinese dynastic histories, the evidence accumulates across civilizations and centuries. Captured royal women experienced a fate that ancient sources themselves acknowledged as worse than death, the complete destruction of identity while life continued. transforming queens into trophies and princesses into warnings. Their suffering shaped ancient political consciousness and international relations. It influenced decisions about war and peace, alliance and resistance. Every ruler considering rebellion knew what defeat meant for the women of their household. That knowledge shaped the ancient world's political landscape as surely as armies and fortifications. We remember them not to indulge in historical voyeurism, but to acknowledge the human cost of ancient empires. Behind every great civilization's glory stood untold suffering, carefully documented by those who inflicted it, and preserved in stone, text, and archaeological evidence. Understanding what happened to captured royal women means confronting how power actually functioned in ancient warfare, through bodies, symbols, and the systematic destruction of human dignity.